So GulpJS is a task manager, and so you use it to basically perform tasks that would otherwise be tedious. And so it allows you to basically just put all these tasks together for your application, just to make it easier for your workflow. So these are the installation steps, and I'm basically going to show you how GulpJS works by showing you some of the more popular tasks that people use GulpJS for. So the first thing that you're going to want to do, like I said before, is you're going to want to have Node.js installed, and then you'll want to install this globally, which is the Gulp CLI tool, and it allows you to run commands in your command line interface. And then you want to install Gulp locally for that project, and then create a file called GulpJS or gulpfile.js. So let's go ahead and do that. So first I'm going to type in npm init to initialize the Node application with the default settings, as you can see there. Then we're going to have npm install gulp development. Then I'm going to go to my text editor and I'm going to create that file that they told us to, which is gulpfile.js. And then we just need to call in that package. Let me just make this a little bigger. Now, if you go back over to the GulpJS website, there's two main pages here that we're going to use, and that's the documentation and the plugins. So the documentation just shows you how to use the core methods of the Gulp API, and we're going to be using these four right here. So gulp.source, you're telling the application where the file is located, or files. And then gulp destination, you're telling it where you want it to output. Gulp task is just the name of the task that you want to perform. And then gulp watch is to continuously watch a file or a location and then perform something if something in that file changes. So I'm going to demonstrate how to use all of these. So going back over to the text editor, I'm going to create a task, and all you do is type gulp.task and then the name of the task. So I'll say test. Then I'm going to pass in a function that returns, a console log. Okay. So now we can go ahead and run this task, and you do that by going to your command line and just typing in gulp and the name of the task. Ours is test. Alright, and there you see our output is this is a test. And so what you can do, rather than typing in the name of the task, you can just type in gulp and it'll run your default task. However, there isn't one configured, and it tells you here task default is not in your gulp file. So let's go ahead and create that now. So within this task, we perform anything that we want. And so what we can do is, as we create tasks, we import it into the default so that by default it will perform all the tasks that we want it to, rather than having to call each individual task by its name. And you do that by typing a comma and an array and then just inserting the name of the task. So we'll say test. So now let's try this out. And you'll see there it spit out our output. So as we build tasks, we'll just keep injecting them into this. For right now, I'm going to delete this task because we won't need it. And I'm going to create a file structure here. I'm going to create a folder for source. Inside of source, I'm going to create two folders. One assets. Inside of assets, JavaScript folder. And actually, I'm going to create another one in there, and I'm going to name this SCSS for Sass. And then inside of source, I'm going to create our index. And then I'm just going to style this really fast. Okay. And so now I'm going to perform a task that takes that index and then moves it to a production ready folder. Alright, and we're going to do that as well with the JavaScript and the Sass. But first, let's start off with HTML. So we'll just call this task move index. And so now we're going to perform these main tasks that I was talking about before. So we'll say gulp, Actually, I just realized I misspelled this up here. Dot source and our index file. Then we're going to add dot pipe and where we want to output it. So we'll say gulp.destination will be a dist folder. Then I'm going to take the name of this task and insert it into the array here so that we perform it. Now let's try this out. Alright, and it tells you there what it did. Go back to the editor, you'll see a new folder here, dist, with our index. Now what I would like to do is minify this so that it will improve our performance. And so what we can use is a GulpJS plugin. Alright, and we're pretty much done with this page. We can just go back to the plugins page. Now if you don't know how to get to this, back over in the GulpJS.com, you just click plugins. Now there's a lot of plugins for virtually everything that you'll need to do. The one we're going to use now is called Gulp HTML Minifier 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and install this. I'm just going to add -d. Okay, and then it gives you an example here on how to use this. Alright, so let's go ahead and implement that. First, what we'll need to do is call in that package, which was HTML min minifier 2. Okay, now we can use it in our application. And so what we'll do is, here we're grabbing the file, and then here we're outputting it. So in between that, right, so after we grab it, we're going to minify it, and then we're going to put it in this folder. And we do that with the same method, pipe. This time we'll invoke this variable here, this const. So we'll say HTML min, and then we'll pass in the options of collapse, white space equals true. Alright, so now let's run gulp again and see what happens. Now if you go back over to your editor and you open your index, you'll notice everything is kind of just crunched up together, right? It's called minifying, and it just helps our application load faster. So we want to do that with all of our files so that the application just performs better, okay? So let's go ahead and do the same thing with our JavaScript file. We'll name this JavaScript. And before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and inject it to the array here. And let's go ahead and build on this. So just like before, we'll say the source is the source folder assets JavaScript. Now rather than specifying one individual JavaScript file, what we can do is use the asterisk.js, whoops. And this will tell it every JavaScript file inside of the JS folder. Alright, currently we don't have any JavaScript files, but let's go ahead and create a couple here. So I'm going to create one called 1.js and another one called 2.js. And I'm just going to create a variable here. And then do the same thing here. Right, then we're going to go ahead and output this the same way, .pipe, gulp destination, the dist folder, except we're going to create a JavaScript folder inside of there. Alright, let's see if this worked. Okay, now if we go back and you go inside the JavaScript file, you'll see both of these right here. Now one problem that we're running into is that these are not minified like the HTML is, so let's go ahead and do the same thing with the JavaScript files. And for that we can use another plugin, and this one is called Gulp Uglify. So on top of installing this right here, we're also going to need to install pump, which is not part of Gulp, but it's going to help us perform tasks easier with this. So let's go ahead and install that. Afterwards, don't forget to also install pump. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this entire function to perform the minification. So let's just grab these and paste these at the top. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to comment it out for right now because we're going to do this a little bit differently. We're going to use their pump package here. And so the way you do that is, well, first you have to pass in callback into the function, and then we'll have to return that later. So we'll say pump array, and then we'll paste in the source. Then followed by a comma, we're going to run uglify, and then finally we're going to output the file. Alright, so we can get rid of these down here. And don't forget, you also have to pass in return the callback, so right after the end of this array here, comma CB. Okay, and then before we test that, what I want to do is kind of add a little bit more to this file so that we will know for sure if it worked. Same thing with the other one. Okay, now let's go ahead and run Gulp. Now if you go back into your editor and you open up the files, you'll see they're all minified now, right? So that's what we want. However, we can improve this even more. And so the way we do that is, rather than having these separate JavaScript files, we can condense them into one file. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually delete both of these, and we're going to find a way to combine those, right? And it's all about just improving the performance of your application. So we're going to use another plugin. This one is called Gulp Concat. So let's go ahead and install that. And actually, if you look down here, the implementation is really easy. You just invoke the concat method and then the output file that you want. Okay, so let's go ahead and install that. Alright, and then let's go ahead and import this. And so we'll just do it right above the Uglify. And the reason for that is because what we want to do is grab the files, concat them together, and then minify them and then output them. Alright. And remember, we have to specify the output name, so we'll just say main.js. Alright, let's try this. And then if you go into your editor, you should see one file here, and it has all the JavaScript files combined. So I want to show you something else. If you notice here, I'm using ES6 syntax, but I'm not in these JavaScript files. Let's see what happens when we do. And you'll notice we get an error here that says unexpected token keyword const, right? Basically what it's saying is, hey, we don't know how to translate ES6. So we have to bring in another plugin so that we can translate ES6 syntax into ES5. So let's go ahead and do that now. And the plugin that we'll use is Gulp Babel. And let's go ahead and install this. And here's our example on how to do it. Just pipe Babel method with the preset ES 2015. Pretty easy. And we can actually do this above all of this, right? Because we want to translate that, transpile that before it gets to any of these methods, right? So what we can do is just use the pipe method and then pass in the Babel method. And then inside of Babel, inside the parentheses, we'll pass in that preset like we saw in the example, which was ES 2015. And that's what ES6 syntax is. Okay, so let's see if it works now. Let's go back to our console and type in gulp. Alright, there appears to be no error. Let's see if it actually worked. If you go into your main JavaScript file, you'll see now that it converted it back to ES5, which is better for the browser. Okay, so now what I want to do is I actually want to create a new Sass file. So we'll name it style.scss. And then I'm going to grab some sample Sass here from their website and just paste it in there. Okay, then I'm going to create a new task. This one is going to be called Sass. Don't forget to add it into the arrays. So of course our source, and then don't forget to specify all SCSS files. Then we're just going to do the basic pipe, and then try to spit it out into a folder labeled CSS. Now this isn't going to work, but I want to show you what's going to happen here. Let's go ahead and run gulp. If you go back into the dist folder, you'll see it just outputs it as Sass, right? So we don't want that. So let's go ahead and delete that. What we need to do is use a plugin to convert this to CSS. So let's go ahead and do that. Going back to the Gulp website, we'll use Gulp Sass. Then you want to scroll all the way to the bottom and then use this one. Alright, so really simple to use as well. It's just a Sass method. In fact, we don't even need this error part here. We can just use Sass. Alright, let's go ahead and install it. And then implement it in our application. And so right above this method, we'll pipe in the Sass method and then see what happens now. All right, there you go. Now we have an actual CSS file. And so same thing, we want to go ahead and minify this just to improve our application. And so for that, we use yet another plugin. And this one is called Gulp Uglify Css. Alright, this one you want to pass in the method, and then you also want to pass the maximum line length, as well as if you want to remove comments or not. Okay, so let's install this. I actually don't want to save this. I want to save to development. Right, and then let's integrate that. And then go back to our task. And what I'm going to do is after we pass in the Sass method to convert it to CSS, then I'm going to go ahead and apply that method. All right, let's see if that worked. All right, and there you go. We have a minified CSS file. Okay. All right, so now that we've done that, we're pretty much done. What I want to do now is I want to create a server, and Gulp also has a plugin for that. And they pretty much have a plugin for everything. They even have a plugin for plugins. So if you want to condense all your plugins into one variable, I guess you could say, rather than having all these declarations at the top, there's also a way to do that. And you can just search, I think it's Gulp load plugins, and what it does is it allows you to just put these all together rather than specifying them all at the top. But that doesn't bug me much, so I'm fine. But let's go ahead and search Gulp live server, and that's what we're going to use for our server. So let's go ahead and run this installation. Now going back over to this site, there's a few different ways to do this, and I'm going to use this one, number 2, so that I can specify what port to listen on rather than using the default. Okay. And then this watch method down here just watches your application so that if anything changes, it automatically reloads. Okay. So let's go ahead and copy this. And then I'm going to implement that. So I'm going to name this task serve. And then I'm just going to paste this down here as a reference. I'm going to change that to 9999. Okay, and the other thing that I want to copy over is this watch. And it has an array here of all the files that you want to watch. So we're going to pass in our CSS. We'll just say watch all CSS files. Our JavaScript. And then lastly, our index. Okay. And so what we're going to do here is basically notify that the server has changed and reapply all the files, right? That's what this is. It's just an array of all of our new files and then reapply it to the server. Okay, so let's see if that worked. All right, according to this, we're serving the files on localhost 9999. Let's try it out. All right, and there we go. We have our hello world that I created when I created the index. And so you'll notice now that if you make any changes to, say, your index file or any of the JavaScript files, nothing happens. And the reason for that is because what we need to do is anytime something is changed, we need to run all these tasks again, or the appropriate task, and move the folders over. Then, once that happens, this will activate. Okay? So inside of our default, what we can do is after the array, we can type in a comma and pass in a function. And then we'll say gulp watch. So the first one is our HTML, right? So it's source, and then we'll say all HTML files. Whoops. And then after that, you want to type in a comma and an array, and then the name of what you want to run. So for us, it's move index. So basically, anytime we change the source file, the HTML, we'll run this task again. And then that will activate the gulp watch for under the server. So the next one that we want to do is the one for the JavaScript. And so we'll run JavaScript anytime anything changes there. Do the same with Sass. And then I'm also going to log a message here that just says watching for files. Alright, so let's go ahead and close this out, and then we'll run it again. And you'll see now that we get my message that I created, and we're still on the same port, so let's go ahead. Okay, so now I'm going to go back over to my application and hit refresh. So now what I want to do is try to change something to see if it automatically updates. So I'll just pull up my index from the source file and change this. And you'll see as soon as you hit save, it automatically refreshes. Okay, and you just want to try that out with all the files. Oh, and actually you're not going to see anything from here because we forgot to pull in this main file here. So going back over to the source index, we're going to add a script for that. And actually it's going to be JS. Okay, and since we did that change, we'll have to close this out and start it back up. So now let's see what happens. Alright, and then I'm going to go back over to the to file and test it in as here as well. And you'll see here in the console log, once we make that change, it's automatically updating. Okay. And lastly, I also want to test that with the Sass folder or Sass file, just to make sure our changes are reflected. And actually, before we make any changes to this, we also have to import the Sass file as well. Right, and then I'm just going to test this by using maybe display none and just make sure that it affects there without the need to refresh. Alright, and so you just want to do that test just to make sure that everything is working properly. Now, one other little thing that I like to add to this gulp file is I like for when I run serve to automatically open it rather than having to go to the browser. So we can actually use another plugin for that as well. So let's search gulp open, and then let's install that. We can close that out. Alright, so there's a few different ways to do this, and the way that I found is easiest is to allow the application to automatically determine what kind of browser is running based on the operating system, and then we'll use that to actually open it here. But first let's go ahead and import this. Oh, actually we're also going to need this package here, OS, so that we can determine what type of operating system we're using. So let's go ahead and install that as well. Okay, now I'm going to go back and just grab both of these. Okay, then going back, I'm just going to copy a few things here. First, I'm going to grab this browser detection, and then I'm also going to grab this configuration. And then what we'll do is .pipe open and then pass in options. So let's go back down to our serve method, and we'll do this right at the end here after we start the server. I'm going to change this to the port that we have set up here. instead of providing the default app, what I'll do is I'll pass in the browser const right here that we create. And so based on whatever operating system it has, it's going to determine what browser you use. Save it to this const, and then we're going to pass it in here in the app. So then lastly, all we need to do is this method right here, which was pipe and then open. So our source is our index file, and then we'll say pipe, open, and then pass in our options. Alright, and that should do it. So let's go ahead and give that a test. I'm actually going to close this one out. Then I'm going to run gulp and see what happens. Alright, there you go. And so it automatically opens our server for us. And so not necessarily a mandatory feature, but just something I wanted to add in there. I think it's pretty cool. So the last thing that we want to do is I want to add a build option here, right? And so the purpose of this is, like, say you want to build all these files and push them out to the dist folder, but you don't want to open a server. Well, we don't want to have to force the user to open up a server every time and have it open in the browser. So we'll just have a task named build that they can just run. All right, so we'll say gulp task build. And we're going to run all of the same tasks here except for the server. Alright, then what I want to do is actually delete this dist folder and run that just to make sure it works. Alright, and there you go. We have our application completely built and ready to go. Yeah, so that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.